Now we'd like to start the second part. This is the roundtable. First, I'd like to introduce today's panelists from here. First, Ms. Yuko Yoshitomi, the president of Rickoff Data. Rickoff Data is a provider of what is thought to be the most frequently used database for M&A in Japan, and also publishes a specialized magazine called MARR Online in the field of M&A. And she has many years of experience as an editor of MARR. And also, it's a personal matter, but many of my articles have been published in the magazine. Thank you very much for coming. Next speaker, next to Ms. Yoshitomi, is from Professor Wataru Tanaka of the Institute of Social Science at the University of Tokyo. He's one of the well-known and influential researchers in the field of Japanese corporate laws and corporate governance. He also participated in the formulation of the guidelines for corporate takeovers, the theme of today's talk, as a member of the study group on fair takeovers. So we'd like to hear from him a lot. And then Ms. Atsuko Furuta, the president of Deloitte Tohmatsu Equity Advisory. She has worked as a director at major securities firms, an IRS consulting firm, and a partner of the management human resources consulting firm, and now the president of Deloitte Tohmatsu Equity Advisory. She has a lot of experience in providing support for hostile takeover defense, dealing with proxy fights, and now we have Professor Becht and Professor Miyajima joining us to have a roundtable discussion. First, we would like to ask each panelist to give a brief presentation, and then we would like to have a discussion later. So first, Professor Miyajima to start.
お願いしたいというふうに思います。それでは簡単にですね、宮島の方から。
So this is Miyajima speaking, and therefore from myself, I would like to explain about why currently unsolicited M&A is a core topic in corporate governance today. And as we do discussion today, I want to talk a little bit about the underlying environment of the Japanese shareholder framework and compare it to overseas. And on this slide, in your first chart, you will look into the background as to why this matter is such a big issue right now. And from my point of view, currently there is a necessity for the companies to go through restructuring. This is something that has been discussed over the past 20 years or so, but that has not progressed well in Japan. But to further accelerate the growth of Japanese companies, we have to move this forward. And this is an issue that we are currently facing, and I do believe this is the core background to the M&A unsolicited issue. Currently, TSE is suggesting that we need to have corporations have more than 1 times in PBR. This was announced in 2023 March. And as you see on the right-hand side, we have many companies whose PBR is below 1. And this is actually a core factor why M&A is very important. So the reason is, number one, there is things like the conglomerate discount. But in Japan, many companies have low-performing divisions or companies, and that is not being restructured. Another issue that we are seeing is that in terms of integration, there's a lot of areas that can be improved. In many Japanese holding companies, they still hold on to many subsidiaries, and this is hurting the profitability. The third reason is as we go through restructuring and as we think about growth opportunities, when the domestic market is shrinking, an important option becomes cross-border M&A. Therefore, when we think about cross-border M&A, it will be partnership with overseas companies or doing M&A with overseas companies. And therefore, it's very important that you have the relevant knowledge, expertise, and also network. So for us to solve this low PBR, M&A becomes a very important and critical matter. Looking into the corporate restructuring in the past in Japan, there has been ages when main banks or corporate groups took control, and we did not see so much restructuring, and that was in the 1990s. And also at this time, hostile takeovers was not very common. So until the mid of the 2000s, we really did not see restructuring occur led by the market. But then, moving on from 2010s to 2020s, we did see reform in corporate governance, and we started to see a new landscape. One is that we saw a lot of increase in M&A, so this was cross-border, especially with foreign funds and foreign companies coming in. For example, KKR purchased Nippon Kokusai Denki and Carlyle purchased Hitachi Kizai. So these kind of incidents are things that we did not see before. And into the end of the 2010s, we also started to see increase in the hostile takeover cases. We had the introduction of Nidec Takisawa case, and before that, we also saw Itochu takeover descent. And this graph is something that Yoshitomi-san is probably going to touch upon as well. But the important thing is from 2014, after the corporate governance reform, we saw many M&A that took place overseas. And then from 2015, we saw foreign companies coming into the Japanese market. So for the domestic market, we have the domestic players doing M&A and also foreign funds doing M&A. I do believe the overseas is actually lower, but it looks like the balance is becoming very close now. So when I look at this new landscape, however, including the foreign private equities and the buyout funds, purchasing Japanese companies all tend to be carve-out cases. So when you are negotiating, there's always a controlling shareholder. And in cases where it's easier to negotiate, and when there is actually widely held block holders, TOB is the only way of control. So in that sense, I think the M&A has not progressed too far. So that's the current situation. And breaking out this into further details in terms of the ownership structures in Japan, as you see in this chart, the details are summarized here. One unique point is that for Japanese companies, when we look at the ownership structure, compared to Europe, where it's concentrated, it's more diversified. Also, for UK and US, it's also diverse, but basically they have a lot of institutional investors, but in Japan, it is actually controlled by the block holders or widely held by public firms. So this is the cross-shareholdings or the relational shareholdings or the listed parent company and a listed subsidiary relationship. Now, when I look into the current status, looking back from 1974, we do have actually a lot of change. So we have the domestic and foreign institutional investors as well as the retail investors. It's almost now about 70%, and for the overall institutional investors, it's about 50%. Therefore, we are seeing increasing institutional shareholder. And in terms of this change in the ownership, one thing that we have to carefully look into is that domestic institutional investors increased, and this is mainly coming from the so-called index fund, such as the GPIF and also BOJ's ETF purchases have increased, and that's the reason why the domestic index fund ownership has increased. And when I look at the overall structure, there's two areas that I would like to focus on. One is that in terms of Japanese leading firms like the Topix 500 or Nikkei 225, companies who belong to the top tier, today we talked about the 7 and I issue, but these companies, about 70% is owned by institutional investors, and then foreign would be over 30%. But there is also about 30% of domestic financial institutions. So this domestic ownership, I think, is very important, that it's above 30%. And then when I think about the defense side, because domestic institutional investors are against the action against hostile takeovers, it's extremely difficult to implement. And then looking into the index funds, basically, when there is a merger or acquisition that is an issue, maybe exiting is not actually what they would like to gain. Therefore, they will say no to the acquisition. So as the project progresses, they may take a neutral position or they may even take a more passive position. So when we look into the leading firms, index fund is a core element that we must not ignore. And then when we look into the small mid-sized cap firms, I would like to also look into what's happening here. So this is actually percentage of share held by foreign institutions based on the company size. So institutional investors only purchase names that they know well. So for the SM cap firms, it's only about 20% or maybe 50% share of foreigners. And therefore, the pressure has not come from foreign investors for the SM cap companies. So good news is after the corporate governance reform, home bias of foreign investors has disappeared. And still, many firms is under the protection of the high cross shareholdings. So the ownership structure is becoming more stable. So for these companies, we have to think about how to encourage the corporate restructuring. We have to give some stimuli so that there is further restructuring. So that will be actually all from myself. I wanted to give you some highlight on the background of our environment. Thank you very much. So next, I would like to invite Professor Tanaka.
So Professor Tanaka, following this presentation, could you please start explanations? Thank you very much. My name is Tanaka from Tokyo University. I research corporate laws. So from the aspect of the corporate law specialist, I'd like to talk about unsolicited takeovers in Japan. And this is my legal perspectives. As for M&As in Japan, we have recent trend that's notable. Unsolicited takeovers do take place, and some of them have already realized this is an important trend. And other than that, we have friendly acquisitions, but still we have some bidders, different bidders to compete with the original bidders. We have many examples of them. When we look at those examples, the recent ones, as long as we see recent ones, friendly or not, unsolicited or not, basically the highest bidders win. So the prices are very important for those bidders. That's very notable. And also, defense measures in Japan. As you know, in Japan, as in the United States, we have similar defense measures, for example, stock options, and we have poison pills that's allowed in Japan. However, the difference between Japan and the US is that Japanese courts generally permit defense measures only when shareholders meetings approve them. 2007, there was this bulldog sauce case in which they had this shareholders agreement and the poison pills became acceptable. But without shareholders' approval, as in Nippon Broadcasting case in 2005, the court screens such cases very thoroughly, and usually they are not accepted by the court. So there should be intention of shareholders. So that means Japanese court has the principle of respecting the shareholders' will. So respecting the shareholders' will, and that is the principle, but that has two aspects. The first aspect is in Japan, traditionally, we have cross shareholdings and also stable share ownership. So when a company has a lot of cross shareholdings and stable share ownership, the principle of respecting the shareholders' will, obtaining the shareholders' approval, can work against the unsolicited takeovers. And that was what happened in 2006, the bulldog sauce case. However, when some companies have high ownership by institutional investors, it serves as a crucial check against the misuse of defense measures by the board of directors or management. So that is crucial. In Japanese companies, cross shareholding is declining right now, and ownership by institutional investors is increasing right now, and institutional investors are exercising voting rights actively. So the second part of the principle of respecting the shareholders' will to prevent the misuse of the right, that is very important. On top of that, going forward, we'll have such important
重要
issues.
な課題だと私考えているのはですね、
So,
同意なき
against
買収の
unsolicited
提案に対し
takeovers,
て、対象会社
how
の
should
取
the
締
target
役会は
company's
ど
board
の
of
ように行
directors
動をする
act
べきかと、
in
対
response?
象会社の取締役の行為規範と
This
いう
kind of
ことが
response
で
should
す
be
ね、
very
非常に
important,
重要な
and
論点になっ
it's
ておると
disputed. In that
思います。
sense,
その点で
I
で
would
すね、
like to
申し上
say,
げておきたいことは、この取締役の行為規範とい
in
う
terms
問
of the
題
board of
は、
directors
た
act,
とえですね、裁判所が株主
even
意思
if we
尊重
have
の
the
原則
principle
を打って
of
いたとしても、 依
respecting the
然とし
shareholders'
て
will,
重要だということ
the
であり
board
ま
of
す。
directors'
それは
decision
ど
is
うして
very
なのかと
important.
言いますとです
That
ね、
means
やはり同意なき
unsolicited
買収という
takeovers,
のは、
even if we
たと
don't
え防
have
衛策
any
がなかったとし
anti-takeover
ても、
measures,
多くの買収者にとっては依
this
然
is
として
very
ハードルの
difficult.
高いものだと思うんで
So
すね。つまり同意なき
sometimes
買収が
unsolicited
ですね、しば
takeovers
しばその従業員その他のですね、ステークホルダー
have to
の
face
反発を
opposition
招
of
き
the
やすい
staff
と
and
いうことが
employees.
あります。それからですね、
And many times,
多くの
according
買
to the
収は
competition
競
laws,
争法上のですね、問
takeovers
題を
bring
生
a
じ
lot
さ
of
せるので、
problems.
競争当局の
So you have to
規制をクリアしな
abide
ければなら
by
ないわけですね。
the
そういう競争法
principles
その
of
他
the
の規制上
competition
の問題を
laws.
クリアするためには、なかなか買収
So
者
it's
だ
very
け
difficult
で、
for
それをクリアするの
bidders
は難し
only
くて、どうしても対象
to
会社の取
address such
締
kind
役
of
会の協力が必要になっ
issues.
てくると。そういう面
They
で
need
で
the
すね、
cooperation of the
やはり同意
board.
なき買収というのが買
So
収者にとってやりづらくて、できれば取
if
締役会の
possible,
同意を
they
得
would
て
like
進め
to
たいと
cooperate with
い
the
うこ
board
と
of
が多いのが
directors
実
because of
情
the
かと思います。
difficulties.
そういうことでですね、対象会
So
社の取締役の行為規範がどういうも
the
のであ
board
る
of
かと
directors
いうこ
targets
とがで
shareholder,
すね、
targets
買
company
収の成否にとって決
and
定的に重要になる
their
という
standard
こ
of
とがし
conduct
ばしばあるのではないかと
is very
思われる
important.
わけです。
And as
そ
Professor
の
Suzuki
先ほど
mentioned,
鈴木先生からもご紹介いただいた
2023,
ですね、
as of the 31st of
2023年
August,
8月31
the
日
Ministry of
に
Economy,
経
Trade and
済産業省
Industry
から出された
issued the
企業買
guidelines
収
for
行動
corporate
指針で
takeovers.
すね、ガイドラインズ・フォー・コーポレート・テイクオーバーズというものはですね、とりわけ対象会社の取締役
So
の
this
行
has
為規
detailed
範について詳細
explanation
に
about the
述べている
standard
わ
of
けでありま
conduct
す。
for the board of directors in responding to a takeover
特に
offer.
重要な点
And
と
this
してで
guideline
す
for
ね、
corporate
買収行
takeovers
動指針はえーっとまあ真摯な
for
買
bona
収
fide
提案、ボナフィ
offers,
ッドオファ
they
ーに
have to
対しては、
consider the
真摯に
offers
検討すべきであると、ということ
sincerely,
をですね、述
it
べて、
states. So that
要
means
は
they
真面目
cannot
な提案をですね、
ignore
無視すること
bona
は
fide
やっちゃいけないというこ
proposals.
とを言ってるわけであります。
And also
そ
according to
れ
the
さらにですね、
guidelines,
ガイドライ
the
ン
board
は
of
取
directors,
締役会が買収提案に応じる方
when they
針
decide
を
on
決
the
定した時には
acceptance of the offer, they have to
株主
consider
に
as much as
とっ
possible
てで
benefit
き
for
る限り有
shareholders.
利な
And they
取
have to
引条
conduct
件を目
negotiations
指
with the
した
bidders
交渉を行
for
うと
that.
いうことを取締役会
That
に
is a
求め
requirement
てい
for the
ます。
board members.
これは
In Delaware, in the
アメリ
United
カ
States,
デラウェア
they
州
have
の
this
ですね、
relevant
デフロー
duty,
義務に似
and
た
the
行
same
為規範
requirement
を
is
求めてい
imposed
る
for the
という
boards
ことが
in
言えるかと
Japan.
思います。デラウェア州法は
According to the
取
relevant
締役会
duty,
が、支配権移転取引に着手した時には、株主にとって、
they have to
合理的
consider
に納得可能な、
appropriateness
最高の価値を
of
追
the
求する
acquisition
義
from
務
the
をと
perspective of
して
whether the
いるわ
acquisition
け
will
であります。
contribute to the
しかしながら
shareholders'
ガイドライ
interest.
ンの行為規範というの
However,
は、レ
these
ブロン義務
METIS
と全く同
guidelines
じで
are
はない
not
と、
exactly the
完全に
same
同じではない
with the
と考
relevant
えておりま
duty
す。
because
特に
METIS
ガイドライン
guidelines
は
are saying
取締
the
役
board of
会が
directors
その
have to consider if the bidding is appropriate or not from the perspective of whether the acquisition will contribute to enhancing corporate value. So corporate value is very important. It should contribute to the corporate value, and from that aspect, the board has to make a decision about the acquisition. So suppose there are two bidding proposals and one has higher price offer, but the board, if the board receives this higher price offer, and when the corporate value declines because of that, the board has to decide against this bid, and they have to agree to the bidder, which can bring higher corporate value. In that sense, these guidelines look like similar to regular duty, but not exactly the same. That's my understanding. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I hope that we can have discussions about many of the points that you mentioned. Next, I would like to move on to Ms. Yoshitomi. She will give us some clarification about the current situation of Japan, and she will share with us some data. So listening to those presentations, she will let us know where we are in Japan.
My name is Yoshitomi from Rake Data. In 1985 and onward, we have this database for M&As in Japan, and it has been 40 years. So the database we have consists of more than 110,000 cases. And in that means between Japanese companies, M&As, and in-out. It means M&A from Japanese companies to foreign companies. Out-in is from foreign companies to Japanese companies. On the right side, the in part is increasing drastically this year. Year on year, 20% increase. We have about 4,800 cases of in. That means M&As between Japanese companies. As you can see here, the number of M&As for Japanese companies have 3 waves. The first wave was in the bubble economy period, that when we invited more foreign investment, and after that the bubble bursted. And the second wave came when we had the institutionalization of M&A laws, and we had a lot of business restructuring, and there was economic recovery. That was the second wave. And then around the peak, Japanese M&A of foreign companies started to increase. And after that, there was a collapse of Lehman Brothers, and after that, Abenomics, globalization and economic expansion, Asian society, and technological innovation, and they became drivers. And now we have the third wave. This year, still we are in the process of the third wave this year. And recently, a series of governance reform is in progress, and we have the guidelines, and also we have the TSE reform, market reform, and that has a great ramification. And M&A is going to be more active, and next year we might reach 5,000 cases of M&As in Japan. This is the value, M&A value in Japan. And out of 3 waves, the second wave, we had companies reconstructuring, consolidation of banks, and we had major reconstructing, and in-out type became larger. The yellow part, recently in-out major cases are increasing. And as Professor Miyajima mentioned before, around 2011, 2018, the green part increased drastically. This is because of the in fund that contributed to listed companies' acquisitions and restructuring. The value started to increase drastically. TOBs in Japan, the number and the value. TOB in Japan, as you know, in 1971, it was introduced in Japan, and after that, harmonization with the other countries became important. So 1990, we had the total reform, and from 1991, continually in Japan, we started to see TOBs. In 2007, 104 TOBs. This was the maximum number. And after that, rather than a restructuring of domestic companies, we have introduced more foreign TOBs, and that was more prioritized. So TOBs started to decline for a while, but right now, because of the business reform and market reform has been going on, so TOB is increasing once again. And by the end of October, we have 67, and now we are in November, and we have 20 cases reported in November so far. So if it continues, 23, that was 2011, and we are going to surpass that. And it's possible that throughout a year, we can achieve the highest number. So from here is the major point, unsolicited TOBs in Japan. There are some cases in Japan as well. 1999, for the first time, we had unsolicited TOB for the first time. And now, so far, we have 52 cases up until October this year. And overall, 1,415, so 3% or so. Compared to the US, it's a very small number. 52 TOBs among the other M&As, 26 investment companies, and operating companies, 26 as well. And still partners, 2007, they initiated the TOB, and it was advertised in Nikkei newspaper. This was a shock for everyone. And after that, we had OG paper and Hokuetsu paper case. And after that, Steel Partners versus Bulldog Sauce case. And it went to Tokyo High District Court. And it was an abusive takeover and the rights plan. The poison bill was issued. And around this point, companies started to employ anti-takeover measures drastically, and after that, the number of TOB has declined drastically. However, right before that, from 2019, for 6 years, 23 cases, so it's about 40% of the total. So 6% is TOB, it's increasing. So out of 23, 11 is investment companies and operating companies more, 12. After 2019, these are all the cases of unsolicited takeovers. The blue parts were successful cases. 10 successful cases. It's increasing, I believe. However, as we look at this Itochu versus Descent and Tokyo Steel versus Nippon Steel, more than 50% of the ownership is not the purpose. They just wanted to increase the voting right and to increase their power of speaking up. So they lowered the threshold of the purchase. That is why they became successful. So as for unsolicited TOB, they have the agents and the securities companies. They were mostly using Mita Securities company. However, recently, for corporate to corporate, for Itochu, They use Nomura Securities, and Maeda Construction, they were using Daiwa Securities, and recently AZCOM versus CNF, and they were using Mizuho Securities Company. So the other major securities companies started to enter this field. And these are recent TOB bid examples. Sorry, this is too much in detail, but as you know, drastically it's increasing between operating companies. Nidec versus Takizawa, this was a single bid and they became successful. And the guideline by METI was supporting this, and they had 100% premium. And there are so many competitive bids. Nitori versus Shimachu and Benefit One and Daiichi Life Holdings M3. This was a competitive bid, and they overturned the first bid. White Knight case was shown before, and we still have such cases, but basically they are offering better management of the business. This is a new approach. And right now, Fujisoft and Seven & I are in progress. These are unprecedented cases, so we'd like to monitor what's going to happen going forward as well. So from here, 3 slides are for your reference. First, about business restructuring by listed companies. Bidders are listed companies. That's one, and also carve out of listed companies. That's number 2. This year, both of them are increasing, 10%, 20% increase. So restructuring of the business by listed companies is in good progress. When we look at those numbers, well, purchasing is increasing, but not selling compared to purchasing. The second one is M&As by activists. More than 5% of the ownership, that's included in our database, and this year, 107 cases. It's drastically increasing, and the breakdown is Tosho Prime, 64%, and Standard, 30%, Growth Market, 5%, 5.6%. This is anti-takeover measures. How many companies introduced and how many companies suspended anti-takeover measures, as was mentioned before. 2008, 569 cases, this was the peak. And after that, 5 years, 6 years, more than 500 cases. However, because of the governance reform and pressure from the shareholders, there are a number of companies which suspended the anti-takeover measures. And so right now it's less than 500 cases, but more than 50% are on Tosho Prime and 40% Standard. So in Japan, we have unsolicited takeover bid. This is not a taboo. This is one of the options in Japan as well. And that started to be more and more recognized. So this is an opportunity to discipline the top managements of the companies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The data was quite solid. I think we are able to understand what's currently happening and the trend that we are seeing. Now, last from our panelists, we will hear from Ms. Furuta. She will touch upon, based on the current situation, what can be advised and how she gives advice to the companies. My name is Furuta from Deloitte Tohmatsu Equity Advisory. So the Deloitte Tohmatsu Equity Advisory is a new company that was founded this April. So this is a company that will be working against the activists, and currently I serve as the director and president. In 1990, I joined Nomura Securities, and around that time was when TOB was being introduced. And as mentioned, the case of Bulldog or Oji Paper was actually handled by Nomura as an advisor. So I was directly involved in these cases. So all my business life, these kind of hostile takeovers or TOB M&As are things that I have been involved in. Therefore, when you have activists approach you or when suddenly you face unsolicited acquisitions, what can you do as an operating company is something that I would like to talk about today. First of all, in 2023 August, the guideline for corporate takeovers was announced. And let's look into the situation before the guideline and after the guideline. So this is clarified in this slide. So even before the guideline was announced, the Ministry of Economy did have a guideline called the Business Restructuring Practical Guideline. And the concept of best owner was handled in this guideline. For example, when there is a subsidiary that is not making losses owned by a listed company, is it right for them to keep on this business? So if they belong to this group, the group will not have new investments come in. So wouldn't it be better for the subsidiary to find a new owner where it can find future growth? So this was a new idea that came from the Business Restructuring Practical Guideline. And then second, about the cross-shareholdings, there is a movement to decrease this. So many institutional investors or grassroots or ISS, the proxy advisors companies, are saying that if you have more than 20% of the net asset, then they will be opposing the appointment of the president. So as a president, you do not want oppositions. So this was actually a difficult position for presidents, and that is the reason why we are starting to see this trend of cross-shareholdings being sold, which effectively means decline in the ratio of stable shareholders. So now we are seeing institutional investors who just work on economics. So they would be domestic as well as foreign institutional investors. And because of these kind of movements taken by the corporations, we are seeing more unsolicited M&As. And then another thing is the proposal coming from the TSE, Tokyo Stock Exchange. Before, many companies did not consider capital costs or the stock prices. Even if you are trading undervalued, many corporations were not feeling responsible for their share price. But there has been warning from TSE that these areas need to be improved. So the mindset started to change amongst the companies. So this is what was happening before the new guideline. So Ministry of Economy has been offering these new kind of guidelines, and the reason is to bring out the potential of growth from Japanese companies. We should actually even utilize the foreign pressure, such as the activists. Let's utilize them so that there can be structural reform taking place in the Japanese companies. So then in 2023 August, the new guideline was announced, and based on this guideline, NIDEC successfully went through the consent acquisition of Takizawa. So this was highly handled in the news. And in fact, this was more of a positive reaction. So hostile takeover or unsolicited takeovers, people started to have less of a rejection towards these kind of action. At the same time, for the unsolicited takeovers, people recognized it as an option for increasing corporate value. Benefit one was acquired by Daiichi Life Holdings. So for you to increase your corporate value, you constantly need to think about which company you want to purchase. And unless you constantly think about this, you cannot immediately take action or do TOB. So as an option, though it might not be friendly, you should always be prepared as to what companies you would like to purchase, even if it's a TOB or if it's a friendly takeover. So companies started to take preparations, and when you have undervalued stocks, there is a higher risk of the unsolicited takeovers. So companies started to understand that as a risk. So within this environment, the management felt that they should not abandon their share price being undervalued because otherwise they would be a target. So this mindset means that it became more of a sound system. The management has a recognition that they need to work on their share price or else they would be targets. So this new mindset was actually something that we saw coming even before the new guideline, but after the announcement of the guideline, it really blossomed. So that is the impression I have. And what can we do when we are dealing with unsolicited takeovers? First, let's look at the defense side. I know there are various different situations, but number one, you could actually be getting the takeover proposal secretly, not publicly. So you might not get it public first, but you might get it under the table. And when it doesn't work publicly, then the bidder will make the bid official and public. And also, you could receive an unauthorized takeover bid after announcing a friendly M&A or MBO. So you announce that you want to do an M&A or MBO, but then you might have a takeover bid from your competitor. So these are the three areas that you have to be prepared for in terms of defense. Next, talking about offense, I think the situation is basically the same. If you have certain companies that you would like to purchase, then you could secretly propose the takeover without consent. And at one time, when the time is appropriate, you could make this proposal public. And also, if there is an announcement of a certain partnership or M&A or MBO, you could actually offer a counter proposal immediately after their action is taken. So I think it's very important that you look into both aspects of defense and offense, because if you just think about defense, then you will be narrow-sighted. So what do you need to do when you are making the attack? If you have that perspective, then that will also be very helpful when you are protecting yourself. Therefore, don't think about just defense, but always think about how you are going to be making the attack, because that will help you understand your counterpart's strategy as well. So when there is an actual attempt of takeover that is unsolicited, then what should you be doing, or how could you prepare? The most important thing is you have to spontaneously, by yourself, bring up your corporate value. So maybe to be more specific, I should say to bring up your shareholder value. So you have to have a shareholder value measure that exceeds the TOB proposal, because otherwise your shareholder will respond to the TOB. So is your current management truly bringing out the potential of your share price? So on the left-hand side, it's very important achieving a fair share price. So you need to look into whether your share price is undervalued or fairly valued or overvalued. This is something that the management needs to have an awareness about. And then going on to the right-hand side, it's also important to understand the shareholder risks. Look into the ownership structure, and when there is a certain TOB at a certain premium, how much application there will be and who will apply for the TOB. I think there are companies who even does the TOB acceptance simulation. So to do that, you need to look into the average acquisition price of your shareholders and look into who would be making profit and who would be making loss depending on the premium amount. So do the right analysis and fully understand your risks. And on the left-hand side bottom, I'm also talking about the governance system. So it's important to prove that the current management is the most competent team to bring up the value. Therefore, the implementation capability of your board is extremely important. So this is not limited to the board of directors, but also outside directors. Especially in terms of TOB, you will have a special committee launched, and the external voices will be very important. So that's why it's important that you strengthen this before it actually happens. Because when you face these issues, and if you are a small company, you don't have external board members who can respond to these needs. Therefore, hire external boards who can actually respond to the needs of TOB or special committees. And then finally, on the right-hand side bottom, I'm talking about anticipating the emergency risks. So it's important that you do an analysis of the expected buyers, and also you also need to look into the consideration of takeover defense. So that will be explaining about how the current management will be in a better position to bring up the corporate value. Also, it's important to look into the advisor team assumptions. And lastly, you should think about the consideration of takeover defense measures to be implemented in the emergency situations, because I know there are cases where you won't be able to introduce this because of your shareholder structure. So if you have high awareness, the companies are actually preparing these elements right now. So thank you very much. This will be all from myself.
はい、ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much.
そう
So anything, Professor Marco, could you please give us any comments? And if not, we'd like to start the discussion.
思います。Marco, do you have any comments on the hearing all these presentations?
Well, it was fascinating to get more details. I mean, the statistics that we saw were even more striking than the ones that I knew. So I think we are really exactly on target to have a discussion about this very important subject. So I think Miyajima-san was exactly right to convene this panel to discuss this very important topic.
了解です。じゃあ、そろそ
So
ろ
thank you very much. Now we'd like to have a discussion.
ですけれども、いくつか Q&A の
We have received some questions,
質問についてもですね、私の方でちょっとある程度
and I actually
想定してほしいという
assumed some of the questions.
それをですね、
And I think we can cover those questions, and we might have some additional questions. So I'd like to take one by one.
じゃあスライドお願いします。まずですね、
So this is my own preference for this is a pattern of unsolicited takeovers, and I compiled it, and then I would like to ask you some questions. So the first pattern, as you can see here, undervalued share prices, PBR is less than 1, as you know, and other than that, corporate poor operating performance. So the performance is not good, so the share prices are coming down. And number 3, as was mentioned, well, actually the panelists didn't really mention this, but corporate misconduct scandals. And later I'd like to talk about Fujitec example. And there was a scandal of Fujitec. It was not actually the share price. And then proxy fights, proxy contest occurred. So not having scandals is very important. The first one that comes in is activists when that happens. And then to avoid activists, there is a DOB bidder, and then the hostile takeover comes. So there is this combination, and one point of those 3 should be a trigger. So the first point to be discussed, I'm sorry, the theme is so big and broad. The second one, so after the guidance was issued by the ministry, actually there is an increasing number of TOBs or unsolicited takeovers. So as Ms. Furuta mentioned, well, rather unsolicited takeovers were accepted positively now in Japan. So I would like to ask you, the panelists, do you think it's a positive move, or do you think it's a shocking trend? Well, of course, it's limited. Some are good, some are not. We have pros and cons, but one by one, I would like to ask each of you. So at our company, Rake Data, we have our statistical report for unsolicited takeovers. We had a lot of discussions. So at the time of reporting, if the board does not approve, this is unsolicited for the management. And we came up with the database with the statistics. And in 2005, the keyword anti-takeover measures was born. And after that, I think the trend stopped in that regard. And we have taken statistics continuously and changing the wording, and because of the guidelines by the ministry, now we say unsolicited takeovers instead of hostile. And now we have anti-takeover measures, and we say defense mechanisms. And so the guidelines were produced by the government, well, because of such changes. So I think it's a positive trend. In 2005, 2004, and onwards, I have been researching the defense measures. And around that time, there was this case of libre and Nippon Broadcasting. So that was TOB or unsolicited takeovers. And In those days, those companies were regarded as outsiders in Japan,
アメリカで言
so
わ
it
れ
was
ている
different
よう
from
な
the
です
US.
ね、
Well,
会
in
社
the
企業価値
US,
を増進するとか
enhancement of the
今
corporate value
経
was the
営のですね
purpose
規律
of
に役立つ
takeovers,
というこ
and
と
it
を
should
なか
be
なかこう強く
contributing
思
to the
って
discipline
人
of
々が言え
management.
なかったなとい
But
う、悩み
that's
が
the
あったんです
US.
ね。
Japan was
で
different.
近年
But
はそれに
recently
対して
in
日本におい
Japan,
て、十分評判を確立している事業会社で
even
も、
though
日本で買
established
収を仕掛けるようになっているというこ
listed
とと、それから
companies,
ど
they
ういなき
initiate
買収提案を
unsolicited
したとき
takeovers,
に、取
and
締
the
役会は
board,
結局その買収提案は価格が極めて高いも
because of
の
the
である
price
の
is so
で、
high,
ま
the
あ、乗り
board
移しで
cannot
きないと
really
いうこと
reject
になっ
it.
てですね、公開買い付けをするときには、
So
抑止的買
when
収になっ
it
てい
comes
る
to
というケース
takeover,
が、少
it
なから
becomes
ずこれまで
friendly
見られるようになり
in
まし
many
た。
cases.
私自身は
So I
利益
myself
買収のですね、規律と
consider
か、
the
経
disciplinary
営陣
effect
の、
of unsolicited
そ
takeovers
の方針
and
その他主
also
的な動機に
the
よって、
corporate value
企業価値を
enhancement.
向上する買収が行われなくなるというようなことに対するですね、
And I
防止策
think
として働くと思ってい
this
るの
could be a
で、
defense.
時には問題のなる買収が
Of course,
行われ
sometimes
ること
some
はあると
takeovers are
思います。そし
problematic,
て
but
こういう現象を
overall,
残
I
してい
think this
ただけ
kind
る
of
のではないかと
trend is
考えておりま
positive.
す。
Thank you.
ありがとうございました。
Marco?
マルコ。
People seem to be very worried about the price. And of course, when you get the 30% premium, the question is, where does that premium come from? So in terms of the market of corporate control narrative, it's supposed to come from managerial inefficiency. Now, for a 30% premium, the company has got to be extremely poorly run. Now, are Japanese companies really very poorly run? Maybe. I don't think they are 30% premium poorly run. So where does the premium come from? And I gave you a list of other possibilities. It could be that what the bidder does is ramp up the risk profile. Just to double down on what that means, it could mean that you take back on carbon commitments and that you actually go back to fossil fuels. Now, that's not just an ethical proposition. It depends about your prediction of the future, about our attitude towards fossil fuels. We know that Exxon has taken a massive bet on being able to dig up fossil fuels for a much longer period of time. That's actually a very risky strategy. Now, maybe you get a 30% premium from this, but you get that from investors who love risk. People like GPIF, the Bank of Japan, the life insurance companies here should not like to take that kind of risk. So they should be opposed. So to me, the first order of question is, how do you decide amongst the shareholders who might have quite different objectives simply in terms of risk? How do you arbitrate between those who love risk, hedge fund activists, either hedge funds, etc., you can give down the list, and those who don't like risk that much, namely the long-term investors, the pension funds, the Bank of Japan, the life insurance companies, and so forth. So how do you arbitrate between the two? So that's really, that's to me the main question. Where does the 30% premium come from?
古田様。
Yes, I basically think this is a positive trend. And the reason is companies cannot really evade something. For example, MBO, lower prices for MBO, or listed companies make 100% subsidiaries and they want lower prices, and that's a fact. But they cannot do it because activists say that the prices are too low, so activists try to intervene. So when you set prices, you have to be aware of it, and that's the practice right now for M&As. I think this is healthy, sound, because shareholders do not interfere. We can set lower prices, and that was the practice before, but now they cannot do it. So in that sense, for capitalism, now we have more healthy situation.
And another point is currently we are supporting many companies against the activists. So especially if you're a cash-rich company, activists will say increase your dividends. So what we advise these companies is keep being a listed company and try and raise your share price. So you have to change your capital allocation, otherwise you will not be able to improve your capital efficiency. And then the answer is, do we really have to increase dividend that much to increase ROE? And then they will come to the answer that maybe MBO might be a better option. So these companies never thought about these options, whether they should do an MBO or whether they should keep on raising their dividends. So these discussions never took place in the board meeting. So the activist is giving them a sincere opportunity to think about what it means to be a listed company and then what will happen when MBO takes place. Because it's not all rosy if you do an MBO, so you have to think about all the risks. So they will be seriously thinking about the risks and the options, and if they decide to be no longer public, then it's actually quite healthy because there's a lot of companies who don't think about what it means to be a public traded company. So I think this is actually giving a lot of healthy trends to the capital market. So as the economist's perspective rather than our market personnel, when I think about the current trend, this is actually really good in terms of bringing out a corporate restructuring because it's much needed in the Japanese companies. So overall, I think this is a good trend. For Nidec and Takisawa, this was actually a very typical case because if it was before the guideline, then we might not have been able to realize the Nidec case. So if there is a strategic buyer, then there are many companies whose corporate value could go up. But the buyer side probably think that it's very difficult to purchase, and then the seller side, before they didn't really think much about selling because the environment did not require them to do so. So unsolicited takeovers does bring more premium and it does bring more corporate value. So the buyer side knows what's required, and then their seller side, before they were protected through cross-shareholdings, but because the environment is changing and with the new guidelines, they have to sincerely consider the proposals. So now it's almost like a duty for them to consider. It's not exactly a duty, but there is this overall trend for them to sincerely think about these proposals. And 7&I is an issue that we are currently facing. So from the economic perspective, is it a good takeover or a bad takeover? That's something that we must consider. As Professor Marco mentioned, in the world of economics, there are actually ones where it's a mal takeover because you have a misunderstanding that you will be able to raise the corporate value, but in fact you can't. And then there's the so-called market-driven acquisition. So if the buyer share price goes up and there's TOB, and if they are able to offer a very high price, but if the environment goes away, then the price will drop. So that is not a favorable case. So in Japan, maybe this is actually a reflection of the fundamentals, but over the past year or two, usually foreigners will offer like 10% or 20% premium, and it's very important that you think about whether these proposals are going to bring up the corporate value. So is it a good acquisition? Is it a bad acquisition? Is something that we have to seriously consider. So that's one thing I wanted to mention. And then a second point that I want to mention is I still don't think there is rules that are related to acquisitions. So things like management buyout is currently being discussed. So you have to pay so much premium to do an MBO. So it's very expensive. So moving towards that kind of trend, I don't think it's a good trend. So if you are competing, you think about what is bringing up the corporate value. So if we could have a framework that focuses on that point, that would be better. Well, the topic of MBO, management buyout, came out. So I think this week or last week, we heard about 6 different cases of MBO. So there are so many announcements related to these kind of acquisitions. So we understand what's behind this. If you are facing a takeover, they would like to become a non-listed company. So I have a question from online members. So 7i is trying to do the same because the family Icko still owns about 7%, so they are trying to work with a trading company and trying to do an MBO. So the question from a Zoom participant is, MBO, is it something that can be highly valued against an unsolicited takeovers, meaning that it's going to be a very expensive premium? So I think Miyajima-san gave us his answer, so maybe we can go back to all the panelists and ask your opinion about what you think about MBO. So we will go from the opposite side of the room. Well, if it's very expensive, then can you afford it, is the question. So for MBO, you might partner with a fund, and then if the fund can use various resources to increase your corporate value, then you could actually add that premium. Or if it's actually purchased by an operating company, then there could be certain synergies that will give you the premium. So the fight is all about that.
Yeah, the MBO, I mean, say that you are going to buy out at a 40% premium. One interpretation is, I'm the management, I've been running the company very poorly, and I'm now going to pay 40% because I'm going to run it much better when it belongs to me. Now that type of manager should be fired to start with. So the question then is, what's the board doing having such a manager in charge? Now, the other option is that the board is not paying the managers enough and they're not working hard enough. Okay, so both is possible, but it seems that then when you can pay these sort of premia for a management buyout, and it's not about tax write-downs or these kind of things, you have to ask yourself, why is management prepared to pay such a large premium? And it then comes also to the question of what's the board doing? Because in some sense, when you can pay these premia, and it is about poor management, board has failed because you can pay these large premia because the company has been poorly managed.
Well, basically, if it's very expensive, highly priced, then you might think that it will bring up the corporate value. So that could be the starting point of your discussion. But the problem is, when there is a management buyout, it's a leveraged buyout, meaning that you are procuring capital for the takeover and that will become a debt for the company.
ことがあるわけですね。そう
What
する
that
と
means is
あの
for the
株主
shareholder,
にとってはハイリターンの
it's a high
ハイリス
risk,
クであっても
but they
ハイリターンの
prefer
方が
high
いいの
returns.
で
So with
LBO に
LBO,
よって債務を大
to
幅に増やす
increase
こ
a
と
lot
で
of
ですね
debt
ハイリ
means
スクに
more
なる
risk
こ
and
と
high
が
risk. So
形に
it's
とって
maybe
は違うの
beneficial
だ
for
って
the
いうことが
shareholder, but then
その
for
際
the
としては
bond
従業員にと
owners
っては
as
不利
well
に
as
なる
the
というこ
employees,
とが
it's
まあ
actually
あるわ
not
けですね。
favorable.
これは先
So
ほ
I
ど
think
ベクト先生の講
Marco,
演
you
で
mentioned
も
this in your
指摘されたこ
presentation.
とであるわけです。
So when we
こ
think
の可能
about
性
this
を考えるとで
possibility,
すね、高い
if
価
it's very
格であ
expensive,
っても
then
当
the
然
board
取締役会はですね
board
こ
should
ちらに賛同すべ
actually
きだとは
not
言
just
いかね
agree
ると
because
こ
it's
ろがある。
expensive.
セブン
So
アイ
for
の場合
Seven and
か
I's
どうか
case,
と
I don't
な
know
るの
what's
か分かり
best.
ませんけれど
However,
も、会社側
as
の
a
問題
company
としても
issue,
ですね、取締
from
役会
the
から見
board
て
perspective,
とても返す
if
見込みがな
they
いぐらい
feel
に
that they
過剰
can't
な
pay
債務
back
を負う
these
ことになる
loans
と
or
判断
debt,
した場合はです
then
ね、対象会社の取締
I
役会はそ
think
の賠
that
償提案を拒否する
the
と。
company or the
LBO だともうそれ
buying
でそ
side
の賠償はでき
should
なくな
selling
ると
side should
こ
actually
ういう
say
ことで
no.
すね。場合によって
So
は取締
the
役が
board
そういう
needs
判
to
断をす
make
る
this
ことが必要になると思い
brave
ます。
decision to say no.
ひとみさんに話して、
So this is a very important point because another source of the premium could be that management wants to take a lot more risk, and that could be the source of the premium. Now, if they find debt holders who are willing to lend them to take these high risks, of course, then they can do it. If it's a singular finance point of view, you can say, oh, that's the problem of the management because they stand to lose what they've invested, and of the bondholders, we should not get involved. However, if the company that they want to buy out and take the risk with is very important, either for a region, a city, or for the country, then it's actually not just their business, but if the company afterwards goes bankrupt, then it's either the state or somebody else who has to pick up the damage or the leftovers that has been left behind. And I think in Britain, we've seen a few of those examples, including some of the water companies that leave some smelly leftovers of this type of thing behind.
So I can only talk from the statistics side, but when Japan first welcomed MBO, we had a lot of MBO that partnered with P funds. But now the management is working with main banks. So that would be the core partner, and they would be getting the financing from the main banks. I think that is a lot of the cases that we see. So it's actually much easier for us to do financing. That would be one thing that we can say. And after becoming unlisted company, then you are a private company, so you can't follow what's happening. And I think that is an issue that we face.
Thank you very much. Now we are running out of time. So I have to skip my questions. Well, I wanted to know what can be prevented, but defense is not something you're positive about, so I'd like to skip it. My last question, this was online as well. Proxy fight and unsolicited takeovers, what is the relationship between them? I would like to talk about this. So, for example, 7 and I cases, Value Act was involved, and the Value Act became a trigger for people to know that 7-Eleven had such problems. So I really think that the Couche-Tard was interested in 7-Eleven before that, but this was an opportunity for them. This was a trigger. The second question is cases where proxy fight results in the activist appointed board. Of course, Well, there's some board members from the fund, so this is not really hostile. On the surface, it's friendly, and I think this is a two-step approach for unsolicited takeover. So this is the same, actually, as hostile takeovers. And they don't have to collect shares. So if they are approved by the institutional investors, they can sell the companies. There's a big impact. And externality was mentioned by Professor Becht. External factor. So as long as you are a shareholder, they have to think about externality. I think that's his opinion. In that sense, one-time cash out with takeover would make shareholders irresponsible. But there are cases which this theory is not true. After a board member was sent by activists, how should we evaluate the company, and what is the voting perspective of institutional investors? This is a very difficult thing, so whoever wants to start. Thank you.
どうもありがとうございます。私、正直
Overall, this is not only about unsolicited takeovers,
アクティビズムに対しても
regarding activism as well. Basically, my attitude is positive.
考えていました。
Unsolicited takeovers, as I mentioned before,
先ほどもお話したようにハードルが高い
they are
もので
difficult,
ですね、
so
そうめったに行う
they are
もの
rare.
ではないと思っています。
They don't often happen, and in Japan, efficiency and profitability of the management are very important for certain companies. So that could be targets of activists, and then they can keep the discipline of the management. So in that sense, the role of activism is big in Japan. And as for activism, there are some cons as well as pros, and one of them is conflict of interest. That's a possibility. Extremely speaking, an activist, for example, owns 20% or 30%, and they hold the veto right to acquisitions. So when they can send many board members, they can bid with beneficial conditions for them. In the past, there were some examples of such cases involving activists, and I believe there were some problems like that. But so far, 25%, 30% ownership by activists shut out external bidders to acquire a company. We haven't really seen such extreme cases. Maybe there are cases I don't know. Thank you. Marco?
The activists give unsolicited advice to the company, but the shareholders remain invested in the company. I only showed you the cover page of Value Act's slide deck of the advice that they gave to the board of 7&I. You can look through there, and there's some things there that appear very sensible, like the name 7i Holdings, maybe not the best name you can have, some of their brand management, etc. So that seems all very sensible. So in some sense, they give free advice to the board. They're like management consultants. So that seems very helpful, as my neighbors have said. Now, of course, for them, it's much more attractive to cash in on a bid than to wait for years for management and the board to improve the company. So that's the less attractive side of what they're doing. And also, they're not all the same in the spectrum of the activists. There is a whole spectrum, and value actors on one end, and then some of the others are on the other end. For example, pushing BP to go back on their carbon commitments, for reasons I've explained before.
なんか古田様。はい。
まずですね、
So
会
first,
社を買収したいというか、具体的になんかやりたい
if you'd like to hostile
TOB に
a
するのか、
takeover,
株主提案にする
well,
のかって
we
結構
have to
考えて
consider it should be shareholders'
株主提案、日本はすごくや
proposal.
りやすい環
In
境
Japan, it's easy to do a shareholders' proposals. The cost is not very high, and if the shareholders' proposals are accepted, that can be a resolution of the company. So the shareholders' right is so big in Japan. So this is a very valid measures. And Fujitech, the majority of the board is run by the fund, so they are very strong.
なかなかそこまで要はボ
But
ードリフレッシュメントみたいな
board
ことまで起こるのは
refreshment
よっぽど会社が
might
まずいって
occur
いう状
when the
況
company
じゃな
management
いと
is
起こりづ
terrible.
らいっていうところがあります。ただ
So it shouldn't happen
一
often.
人二人社外取締
Sending
役
one
を
or
送り込
two
むみたいな
external
提案
board
は
members,
別にそういう人が増えてもいいんじゃないかっていうような
some
判断を
institutional
取締役はする
investors
の
think
で
it's okay.
そういった株主
So
提
that
案
kind
は
of
割と通りやす
shareholders'
い方向になります。で
proposals
一
would
人
be
でも二人で
accepted.
もそ
So
ういっ
one
た
or
人
two
が
people
入
are
る
sent
と
to the
今度取
board,
締役会の
and the
空気が
atmosphere of the
変わって
board
きます。
becomes
で
so
やっぱ
different.
りそのなあなあ
They
で決めるの
cannot
も
reach a
できなく
conclusion
て、き
easily.
ちんとそういう取締役
They
から
have
提案があったら
to
検討しなきゃいけない
deliberate
とかってなるので、
on
そういうところから
shareholders'
徐々に徐々
proposals,
に
and that's
侵
how
食していくって
they
いう
kind
や
of
り方っていうのも
erode
あります。で
into
や
the
っぱり一
board.
番怖いのはですね、株を
And
買われる
the
ことも
most
怖いんですけれ
scary
ども、
thing
取締
is
役会
the
の責
majority
任を
of the
捉えるって
board
いうのは本当
that's
にもう
taken
会社
by
がそこで
activists
経験が変
because
わって
that's
し
the
まうっていう
change
こ
of
とになる
ownership,
ので、
change
た
of
だ日本
control. If you
守
want
る
to
側としてはやっぱり
defend
株主
the
提案のリス
company,
クってい
you
うの
have to
も
consider the
同等
risks
に
of
検討しておか
shareholders'
なければいけないですし、
proposals.
TOB よりも
Well,
コストがか
compared
か
to
らないんで、
TOB,
ま
the
ずは
cost is
経営
lower,
権に揺さぶりをか
but
けら
they
れるっていう意味
can
では非常に有
shake
効な手段だと。
the management. In that sense, it's very effective. Sorry, the time has run out. Well, there is another very sensitive question I wanted to discuss. However, well, among ourselves, we would like to have a discussion. We are very sorry. It's difficult to take up this theme. Right now, there are so many questions that came and so many comments we received. Professor Kim,
何かお話になりたいことはありますか。
well, from Korea,
韓国の方からですね、
Dr. Kim is here,
ちょっと最後に
and he has a
質
question.
問があるということなので、キム、ウージュン
So I'd like to hand over the microphone to Professor Kim from Korea.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so thank you very much for all the lively discussions and presentations and everything. So my first impression, we have a long way to go. Korea, you change your name. So you don't call it hostile takeover anymore, but you call it unsolicited. That itself, I think, is a big change. So one of the questions I have is that it seems like before you had these cross shareholdings and a lot of anti-takeover measures, which de facto did not allow these unsolicited takeovers to occur in the first place. So I noticed that past 10 years, anti-takeover measures has been going down. And also the degree of cross shareholdings, it's going down, it's being dismantled. And were these direct objectives of the government? So government had a lot of initiatives. And then, so getting rid of these cross shareholdings and anti-takeover measures seems to have contributed to this kind of atmosphere which allows these unsolicited takeovers to occur, and so what was the government's influence on these changes? Without this government's influence, would we still observe these active unsolicited takeovers now, or not, basically?
これは宮島先生ですかね。ずっとやってこられた。
Thank you so much. And my feeling is there is a two stage of the government stance or attitude to hostile takeover or ownership structure of Japanese firm. And first phase is early 2000. And this was the time when the Japanese government used to be very supportive for cross-shareholding or stabilized shareholder schemes in Japanese firm. But this was changed. So the bank firm cross-shareholding between bank and firm was dissolved and supported by a government guidance and other measures. And also increasing the hostile takeover or shareholder activism. For those changes, the Japanese government at that time was very, say, not negative, but neutral, at least neutral, and not the position to support these activities. So that government tried to set up the clear rule for takeover and takeover defense in the middle of 2000. And recently, the Japanese government stance has been changed both on ownership structure as well as a takeover defense. So as you know, the cross-shareholding or relational shareholding is now regarded as the sources of decreasing the corporate efficiency among Japanese firms. So that the government encouraged the Japanese firm to reduce their cross-shareholding. And also we emphasize today, the Japanese government decided to push corporate restructuring through the measure of these kind of the so unsolicited, even unsolicited takeovers. So that the rule was changed and a clear rule was set. In some cases, the unsolicited acquisition was promoted by Japanese government through the establishing this guideline in the last year. So that the current situation is, although pushing these unsolicited takeover, the negative side of this policy direction is there might be some possibility that bad acquisition or bad bidder will come to Japanese market. So that how to address this issue is current issue. So now we are discussing on that. So that's my understanding of the current situation.
Well, thank you very much. Just to give you a 1 minute summary of the situation in Korea, we don't have so much cross shareholdings, but we have, as you all know, we have very strong family control of these publicly traded firms, which is the biggest hurdle for facilitating these tender offers or hostile takeovers. Up to date, we have very few incidences of hostile takeover attempts, which haven't been very successful. And this is something, so we are way behind Japan in the market for corporate control. We envy you very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That was Professor Woo-Jin Kim from Seoul National University. Thank you for joining.
So I apologize for us going over the time a little bit, but now I would like to close today's session.
Thank you very much for coming at the expense of your very busy schedule to attend this symposium organized by RIETI, ECGI, and WBF. And I'd like to thank everyone who participated today, and the organizers, and Professor Becht, Professor Tanaka, and Ms. Furuta, Ms. Yoshitomi, who took time out of their busy schedules. Thank you very much. And I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the RIETI staff members and ECGI members, especially Ms. Elaine McPartian and the staff of our university, and the Waseda University Academic Solutions, and the interpreters. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for participating today. Our center will continue to hold a Global Insight series on a regular basis. So I really hope you will join us again. And so far, we haven't decided when for the next one. We have the questionnaire form online, so please give us your feedback for this webinar. We'd like to use your feedback for the next event. With this, we'd like to close the webinar. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, and see you again.
お目にかかりましょう。